Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our second live creator chat of the day with comic creator Pornsak Pichetshote. Before we begin, I will be starting with some interview questions, but please remember that this is an interactive chat, so we encourage you to ask as many questions as you'd like throughout the session using the Zoom chat feature. I'll be keeping an eye on the text chat and I will read any of your questions out loud throughout the session. And now that that is out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for being with us today, Pornsak. Pornsak is a Thai American rising star editor, was a rising star editor at DC's Vertigo imprint, where he worked on such comics perennials as The Sandman and Swamp Thing, two little titles I am positive you've heard of. His books have been nominated for dozens of Eisner Awards, be it the award-winning Day Tripper, the New York Times bestseller The Unwritten, or critically acclaimed darlings like Sweet Tooth and Unknown Soldier. He left Vertigo to become an executive in DC Entertainment's media team, where he started and oversaw their TV department. Infidel marked his first major comics work as a writer and was met with universal critical acclaim and awards. And his newest work with Image Comics is The Good Asian. I would love to hear a little bit about this new book, especially for readers who may somehow have not already started the series, and I'm sure are itching to begin.
Sure. The book is called The Good Asian, and it's a genre I'm calling Chinatown Noir, a 1936 detective story in the style of Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, and featuring the first generation of Americans to come of age under an immigration ban, the Chinese.
It's such an interesting time to set a story in, and it's such a rich vein of like literary possibilities. I'm wondering how you came up with the idea, and then what was it like to bring it from, concept to execution?
Coming up with the idea, it was funny. My dad is, I self-identify as Thai American, even though I'm Chinese on my dad's side. And the reason I do that is because whenever my parents would get into debates and fights about politics, my dad would always, if my dad was losing, he would always end those conversations like, that's, it's like, that's a problem with you Thai people. And my mom was like, you're Thai. And my dad's like, no, I'm Chinese. And she's like, you don't speak Chinese. You've never been to China. Don't give me all that Chinese stuff. And so, but as my dad got older, he got more into his Chinese roots. And so when he passed, part of me processing sort of the loss was me, wanting to get into the stuff that he was into and getting into sort of Chinese history. And for me, because I'm kind of obsessed with Americana and pop culture, that I ended up drifting into Chinese American history, and that's where I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Immigration Act of 1924 that banned Asians and Arabs from coming into the country. And I was kind of embarrassed that, like, as an adult, I didn't know about any of these things, and especially because I had this sort of pop culture addled mind, I instantly thought of sort of the Asian crime solvers of the 1930s, Charlie Chan being the most famous, but also Mr. Moto and Mr. Wong Detective, and how in the 1930s they were an enormously popular sort of like subgenre within sort of movies and crime fiction, and it was fascinating to me that was as popular as it was, even when Asian immigrants weren't allowed into the country. And that's kind of what started the process of like combining the two, doing one of those kind of stories, but being sort of honest and taking what we know now about racial history, into the mix. And that's kind of how The Good Asian came to be. And as for like the work it took, I mean, it was just, I realized really soon I know when I'd done it, because it was so much work. It was like a lot of research. It was, there were that if you're looking at what life was like for sort of working class Chinese, especially in the 1930s in Chinatown, there's like no books that you can go to for that. And so what I had to do was I had to take some stuff about immigration history, some stuff about, Chinatown at the time, some stuff about, Asian American history in general, and just sort of all like composite it together. And then and then all that, filter that through kind of like this, gumshoe noir, 1930s Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, Continental Op, kind of like that kind of fiction and just sort of push it all together. So it was so it was just a lot of reading and a lot of sitting and stewing to make sure it works.
Well, sitting and stewing is something that I do pretty much 7. So I'm glad to hear that you figured out a way to make that.
Yeah. We'll see. Jury's still out.
You mentioned a lot of things that I immediately want to like spin off and talk about. In a multiverse, I'm sure we're talking about all of them. But specifically, when you mentioned that, like, it was surprising how many of these characters were so popular in the 30s, given the sort of monoculture's attitudes towards Chinese Americans. And I think that you see that also with the minstrel shows and America's attitudes towards Black Americans, and even the noble savage attitudes, stories that were so popular. They were huge, not just here in Europe. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what is at play here in this confusing and sort of tragic juxtaposition of loving people like Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto, which when I heard Mr. Moto, I was like, someone else on the planet knows who that is. But also vilifying real life people.
I think it's funny, like, and I think if you're a fan of comic books specifically, you see a lot of it where I think there's a lot of noble attempts to sort of be progressive sort of for that time. And then when you look back, you're just like, ooh, it's like, oh, that's uncomfortable to sort of, look at now. And you're sort of seeing it now too, as we specifically with comics reboot and reimagine and all this sort of stuff. So I think I think part of it is that. I think part of it is, because Charlie Chan at the time was created as a response to Fu Manchu, which was like a much more negative, stereotype and for Asians. So I think at the time, a lot of it comes from sort of meaning well, but it's sort of that lack of ignorance. And, the world was a bigger place. It was back then. It was harder to get information at your fingertips. It was harder to hear what different communities were saying. So it was easy to think that, I even though I don't allow rooms for these people to sort of, express their opinions and express their perspectives, by the limited stuff that I have and me with my heart being in the right place, it's enough for me to like just do these things without realizing the harm that kind of comes from that. And I think, I think one of the things that like Twitter and the internet, for all as much as we criticize it, what that has made happen is allow those perspectives and those opinions to be a lot more vocal, to influence the room sort of a lot more. And to me, that's partly where that comes from.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's so complex and so fascinating. I think a lot of people also might not understand how devastating the Chinese Exclusion Act was. In fact, I don't know how many people think about or have learned about, been educated about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or even the existence of Angel Island in terms of it being an immigration portal. How much did you know about it before, writing the story about both places? And what was it like to go then and tackle this time period?
I mean, it was. I didn't know much about it. Like I said, this book was a lot of research and a lot of deep diving, and so there was a lot of time. And fortunately, the way my sort of life works is, I'm usually working on a couple projects first, and I see another project on the horizon, so that gives me time to kind of read and research as I'm working on other things. And so it was a lot of time though I didn't, before I decided I was going to write this book, or the process of deciding to write this book was me learning all of it. I went to high school in Thailand, and so as a result, American history wasn't taught. So I've heard that, there's a small mention of it in high school American history, and even though I've heard like a lot of people just sort of gloss through it, but so I didn't know about any of it, and so I just kind of part of me writing the book was sort of doing all the research, but also too, I don't think I could have written the book. I have a historical consultant by the name of Grant Din, and he kind of is. I do a lot of research going in, and he's kind of my last line of defense. And he like reads my scripts and reads the proofs, and just like, oh no, here's what you got right, here's what you got wrong. There's also this you might want to take into consideration, and that's kind of how I went by it. But yeah, no, the Chinese Exclusion Act, it prohibited uh, Chinese immigrants up to, except for very specific classes. It was originally, to keep out Chinese laborers, but it affected a lot more people than just that. And it's, so you could, if you were Chinese, you couldn't come into the country unless you were part of these very specific categories. And all the Chinese immigrants, because they were coming in through the Pacific and if you came across the Atlantic, you came across Ellis Island, which, there's a lot of stories about how tough that was. But the Angel Island was, especially if you were Chinese, were much tougher. You were kept in sort of these barracks, and you could stay there for anywhere between a couple hours to a couple of days to a couple of years, as they tried to, they would give you basically entrance exams where there are interviews about 100 questions long, where they asked you, all these different minutia facts about your life in China, and then they would go ask someone else, a witness that you would have sort of in America, to verify these things. And if they didn't line up enough, you couldn't get into the country. And that was after you spent like about a month on a boat to get here. So it was a very rigorous process because they expected so many Chinese immigrants to be illegal.
Yeah, I 100% would have died.
I would not have lasted well. I would not have lasted well.
I would have died on the boat. I never would have gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was so surprised to read that spouses couldn't come. That was shocking to me. The idea that you could send your child over to this country, but if you were married, your wife couldn't.
Yeah.
That is shocking to me.
Yeah, during that, there was a window where that wasn't the case. It's kind of amazing to me. There was a lot of stuff I didn't know. Like I didn't realize, I guess, women being unable to come into America was one of the reasons why Chinatown was predominantly male, and it became sort of a city of, it became known as a city of vice because there just weren't many women in the country that were allowed to come in.
Yeah. Which I think, again, is also fascinating if you think about it as a microcosm of San Francisco and, in fact, the West Coast in general, because those were both lands where there were no women, and they became cities of vice because there were just no ladies. Interesting. In terms of Edison's background, I think it's fascinating also the way we get glimpses into his past as you're going through this story, the mystery that he's unraveling. And one of the things that really struck me was how you've depicted the sort of double consciousness that he has to exist with.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what it was like to write that for him, and whether as a mixed person, did that present any unique challenges or unique opportunities for growth for you as you were writing out this other character?
Yeah, definitely. It was definitely something good. I enjoyed getting a chance to talk about it, especially with sort of an Asian American character, because I'm so glad you landed on that term, double consciousness, because that is very much what I was thinking at the time. What immediately pops to mind, and it hit me at a very early on when I was reading it, but there is that W.E.B. Du Bois line from The Souls of Black Folk, where they talk about this feeling of double consciousness, this looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measured by a tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, I think is how the quote goes. And it's sort of always sort of felt that, as an Asian American here, and it's tricky because as a writer, with a certain limit of the characters that you tell, there's certainly aspects of that I can write about the Black experience, but that's not my experience, so I don't feel comfortable sort of leaning in. So having a chance to write a Chinese American character and an Asian American character gave me a chance to actually talk about all that stuff and what it was like in my life. And I think Hark, Edison Hark exists in this space where, and I think it's a space common to for certain Asian Americans, where you have a certain amount of privilege, but more privilege than some, but not as much as others, especially as an Asian American man. And so as a result, he's constantly negotiating, well, how much do I want to stand up for people like me? And how much does standing up for people like me will actually not just hurt me, but hurt my ability to sort of just help people like me? And, the interesting thing about doing it in 1936 and in this particular genre that the book is set in, is all that has a lot more stakes, and all that is a lot heightened, is very heightened. And all this stuff that's sort of existential and internal sort of conflict gets very externalized. And so you can really kind of play it out in sort of dramatic, and hopefully the goal is that, you can take stuff that's existential and internal and really play them out, so you can kind of see the things that are like pulling you back and forth. Like even, something like in issue 3, we reveal that, and this was true for, Edison Hark was based on the first Chinese American cop in Hawaii, that when he started off, for all intents and purposes, as an undercover agent, he would go into Chinese opium and gambling dens, and then he would have to report back to the cops and say, like, all right, here's the people you need to look out for when you go raid the place. So he was, in a sense, weaponized against his own people. So, and that to me is externalizing this sort of internal conflict of, what is my allegiance? Am I more Asian? Am I more American? What does that mean? What is my loyalty to myself and to other people? And hopefully we get to do that in the book with sort of higher stakes and dramatized through external characters.
Yeah, no, it's very successful, I think, especially in the noir genre. All of those microaggressions become very real macro actual aggressions.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it's super smooth, and I especially love having an anti-hero. I think an anti-hero lets the audience connect with those issues a little bit easier than if it were a hero, because the flawed protagonist, you can sort of allow them to take these missteps that provide your reader with lessons and experiences that I think would seem cheesy if a Superman type did it.
Totally. I think the thing about Hark is that he is very much a flawed protagonist, but I think one of the reasons why people are nevertheless drawn to him is the fact that, as flawed as he is, it's hard to say what other choices he could have made at the time to do what he wanted to do that didn't lead him to sort of that place. Like, I think ultimately the only thing he could have done to not be the person that he was going to be was to not be a cop. And and part of him continuing to be the cop kind of led to this compromise sort of position that he's in, and that's sort of a product of the time, and we can use that as much as we want to sort of as a mirror to reflect what things are going on today. But I hopefully that's part of the push and the pull is the fact that he is a deeply flawed character, but at the same time, hopefully if you're in his shoes, it's not exactly clear what turns you would have taken that would have made you avoid the place where he ended up.
Yeah, like what else could he possibly have done?
Yeah.
I also really appreciate the fact that he knows he's a flawed character, which is that level of self-awareness is really nice in comics, especially when sometimes you get plot points or conflicts that come from characters not understanding themselves or just not saying something
right.
So I really appreciated that about Edison's character.
Yeah, and that's just one of the gifts of working with noir. It's part of the genre, so you can really just sort of lean into it.
Yeah. So you had written previously something in the horror genre at Image. You'd written Infidel, and now you've moved to noir. Did you feel like any of the skills or techniques that you utilized in horror played well in noir? And was there anything that you are getting to do in this particular genre that's like stretching a muscle, that you hadn't been using?
I mean, all of it's stretching a muscle for me. And that's the exciting thing. It's also like the nerve-wracking thing. It's one of the reasons why, I'm so grateful to have my editor, Will Dennis, who's edited some of the best crime books, out there, 100 Bullets, Scalped, DMZ. He's edited some of the best crime books out there. So it was really great for me working with him and him having that support. And then working with Alex Tefenji on the art, who just he's so amazing at what he does. It's just a great he's such a great storyteller, and his acting is so great. It's a great foundation to build off of. But so much of it was new for me, and a lot of it was leaning very much on telling character stories that I'm comfortable with, even though the genre was different, and making sure I'm trying as much as I could to be as true to the crime noir, that gumshoe noir genre, as I did the horror genre in Infidel. And so Infidel kind of helped me in the sense of like, all right, the audience will go with you certain places, but let's make sure that we kind of hit these touchstones of the genre, and the fun of taking the beats that we know and just sort of turning them like 30 degrees here, 90 degrees there. So that was really helpful. And it's one of the things, I think one of the two things that horror helped me. And one, I learned from being just a huge fan of Garth Ennis's work, is Garth, who is also a great horror writer, is also a great, he writes many genres well, war being one of them. And one of the things he does that I've definitely sort of took note and learned from is the fact that he'll eventually use some horror conventions in his war books. And what it does is it makes the books more immediate and more visceral. And so that's something I try to keep in mind, of just like, taking a little bit of those horror skills, and whenever I'm in a different genre, and just dipping their toe in a little bit, suddenly it makes the genre, just a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more unpredictable, because you're not expecting that level of intensity in the work. And so that was something I learned from being a fan of Garth Ennis's stuff, who wrote Preacher, most famously Preacher and The Boys. And then for me, horror, the way I look at horror is horror, there's so much surrealism in horror, and that involves to me sort of playing with the form. And so it was taking that level of experimentation, and it's why I love working with Alex so much. And taking, in Infidel, there was so much I couldn't do in terms of playing with the form of comics, because I didn't want to draw attention to the page itself, because part of the thing in Infidel was just trying to have you just have you fall into that story and forget the fact that you're reading a comic, really have it be a lived in experience. With something like, The Good Asian, it is much more, it at times is more of a cerebral genre. And so because it's more of a cerebral genre, I can say like, hey, this is a page, and let's see all this fun stuff we can do with the page. And I can, rip off my friend Jeff Lemire and do all the cool stuff that he does, or try to do my bad version of them, and all that stuff.
Did Alex have a background in horror as well, or because there's one panel, not to do spoilers, but there's a reveal where a little boy finds something, and until then it hasn't really been a horror comic, but right in that moment, oh God, it's so visceral.
And no, he didn't have a horror background. I mean, he does a lot of slice of life stuff, and his last book was another book through Image and Skybound called Outpost Zero, which is a little bit more sci-fi. And so that's one of the reasons why his acting is so good. And he does just stories about people so well. So no, but you're exactly right. That was a part specifically where it's just like, all right, we're gonna dip into some horror, tools here, just to give a little level of, to make the story have a little bit more of a bite, to make it feel a little bit more visceral, to have it hit a little closer to the bone. And then from there, it's me and, Alex working together to find out what's in that particular, page, those pages you're talking about, what's his horror sort of sweet spot? How can I take what, his clean lines and really sort of make that beat hit home.
It's very successful. I was very shocked because I read Outpost Zero and I was like, oh great, I his work. He really drew a cool robot and some cats that I really liked. And then I was like, oh God. We have a question from the audience, or a comment. It's from Michelle, and Michelle says, I am stoked to read The Good Asian. Pornsak is a fantastic speaker on these panels. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
I loved his input during the AAPI Comic-Con at Home panel, and I'm hoping he does a comics experience interview.
Oh, I would love to. I would love to. I think I would love to do a comics experience interview. I think I have. I think I have a signing sort of planned there at some point. As I say that, I realize, is that public yet? I don't know, but I think it's happening.
Well, anyone who would like to check on that can email us at chloeramos@imagecomics.com, or to arrange other interviews and programming with Pornsak. You can always reach us there.
Cool.
which sadly we only have about 6 minutes left. So before I forget, I would love it if you would tell everyone where they can find you outside of this conference, since I'm sure everybody's going to want to follow your work after this.
Oh, thank you. On Twitter, I am real_Pornsak, and on in Instagram, I'm real_Psac.
Excellent. Thank you
Those
very
are the
much.
two best places.
Wonderful. Even though Twitter is also the absolute worst place.
Yeah, it's a minefield. You got to be careful with Twitter. You got to be careful with
Yeah,
Twitter.
I
I've
wish
been
it were.
very grateful to the people that I've interacted. Very, very grateful, actually. I haven't had, oh God, knock on wood, I haven't had that story yet. But yeah, no, you have to watch yourself.
Yeah, it's mostly good in Library Landia. People know
Oh,
how
I
to
can see that.
behave.
Yeah.
So I had one last question.
Sure.
We're currently in this mystery with Edison in San Francisco. But we've learned that he hails from Hawaii. And I'm wondering if you have any plans to expand his flat footing to other shores.
You will. I feel comfortable saying this. Issue 4 just came out yesterday, so everyone go to stores to pick it up, and we will see Edison Hark in Hawaii next issue in issue 5.
Excellent. I'm so pumped about that. All right. Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming out and talking with us today.
No, thank you. This was fun, and thanks to everybody who tuned in and showed up. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, I will talk to you again soon. I
Yes.
hope everybody
Yeah.
enjoy the rest of your conference, and Pornsak have a wonderful day.
Bye, guys.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.